Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first event of BU's Alumni Reunion Weekend. This is going to be a very, very exciting program tonight and a great weekend. This is part of the new Howard Zinn lecture series and is a part of the larger Alumni Weekend. We hope that those of you who are present will be able to take part in a number of the events, and I'm sure by the time the evening gets going tonight, you'll agree that this is about the finest kickoff we could possibly have. The Howard Zinn lecture series at BU is made possible by a generous gift from Alex McDonald, who's a member of the College of Arts and Sciences class of 1972, and his wife, Dr. Maureen Strafford, a member of the BU Medical School class of 1976. Thank you, both of you. It's a wonderful gift. Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce the four panelists in reverse speaking order and then tell you how the evening will go. I'm going to leave our guest of honor and the namesake of the lecture series for last, so we can say a few more things. The first person I wanted to introduce is, in reverse order, is Mary Gordon. Mary Gordon is the author of 6 novels, 3 memoirs, well-recognized collections of short stories, as well as other works. Her newest book, Reading Jesus, A Writer's Encounter with the Gospels, was just published. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, the 1997 O. Henry Award for Best Story, and the 2007 Story Prize. She currently is New York's official state author, and she teaches at Barnard College and lives in New York City. The next person I want to introduce is Ellen Goodman, well known around the Boston area. Ellen Goodman's Pulitzer Prize-winning commentary appears in more than 375 newspapers. Her column in the Boston Globe has been syndicated since 1976, and she won the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Commentary in 1980, only one of the many awards and prizes she's received. She was one of the first women to open up the op-ed pages to women's voices, and she has published 6 collections of her columns and is the co-author of I Know Just What You Mean, The Power of Friendship in Women's Lives. James Carroll is Distinguished Scholar in Residence at Suffolk University, and he's been a columnist for the Boston Globe since 1992. He served as Catholic chaplain at Boston University from 1969 to 1974, before leaving the priesthood to become a widely published writer of fiction and nonfiction. He's published 10 novels, several of which have been national bestsellers. He is a well-recognized nonfiction writer as well. His memoir, An American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us, received the 1996 National Book Award in nonfiction, and his book, Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, A History, published in 2001, was a New York Times bestseller and has won widespread recognition. And of course, Howard Zinn, the namesake of this lecture, has had a long career as a scholar, an activist, a teacher, a writer, and a playwright. He has a long and well-known connection with Boston University, having served as a professor of political science from 1964 to 1988, when he retired and became a professor emeritus. I've traveled all over the country talking to alumni, and it has become clear on every single one of these trips that Howard is beloved by all his students and by his students of many, many different points of view. Let me ask, are there people here who were students of Howard's when you were here? Could you stand up and give your teachers some applause? And there are many more out there. When I travel around the country asking about alumni, Howard is one of the first people always ask about, and I've been very fortunate to get to know him in the past couple of years since I've been here at BU. Among his writings, he's best known for A People's History of the United States, which has sold over 2 million copies and has been translated into a dozen languages. And he's the subject of a fascinating documentary that can be seen on the History Channel in December. On November 5th, in fact, A People's History of the United States, the documentary that will be on the History Channel, will have a performance of pieces of it here, sponsored by the CAS Core Curriculum, the Honors Program, the Department of Political Science, and the Department of History. So I hope that those of you around will watch for this November 5th in the evening, and I've been told if I'm a very good dean, I might get to play Susan B. Anthony. Howard's published over 20 books, the latest of which is Uncommon Sense, and it includes his memoir, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train, which was also turned into a documentary. And of course, as many of us know, he is also the author of 3 plays. So here is your panel for tonight. Let me just tell you how we're proceeding. Each of the panelists, first beginning with Howard, and then proceeding down the line, will address our topic for the evening, the vision of change, vision and reality in the Obama presidency, for 10 minutes or so each. After they've each made their comments, we're going to open up the 2 mics here you'll see on either side to have open discussion. I'll come back here and you can ask them questions individually or throw questions or comments to the panel. And then around 8:30, I'm going to go back to the panel and ask each of them to make very brief closing remarks and to close out the evening. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. Join me in welcoming our panelists on the topic of vision of change, vision and reality in the Obama presidency.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Virginia. Can you all hear me? Yes. Oh. I'm surprised. Dean Shapiro has been very important in enthusiastically welcoming this series and working at it, and it's been really a pleasure working with her on it, and to have a kindly relationship between us and the BU administration is something we're trying to get used to it. And I also want to give special thanks to Alex McDonald and Maureen Stafford. And I don't know if you know this, but I'll tell you. They're the ones who really initiated this. They're the ones who have supported it. They're the ones who have financed this. I know you're not supposed to talk about money in an educational institution. Educational institutions, as we know, have nothing to do with money. Alex and Maureen have been absolute stalwarts in organizing and moving this thing, so I thank them. And I'm honored to be with my fellow panelists. I could claim that I don't know them, but I confess I do. So I'm happy to be here with, I have no idea what they're going to say. I'll listen very carefully, of course, make sure they agree with me, but it's all unpredictable. So yeah, we're talking about Obama, right, and the Obama presidency, a very delicate question, because why? I don't know if you've had the same experience. It's not easy to talk about because we all, I say we all, who knows? I think we all greeted Obama's victory with exultation. I did, my friends did, a lot of people did. It was a wonderful moment for various reasons. Well, one, we're getting rid of the worst presidency in American history. right? you know, you know. And yes, and then a historic thing, the first president who is African American. That's quite remarkable. It tells you something. I think it tells you something positive about what has happened in this country over the last decades, because this would not have happened 40 years ago. So it was a remarkable moment. And I remember for me, there's a sort of special moment of excitement when I saw on television on the night of the victory. I saw on television they showed Spelman College students, where I had taught in Atlanta for 7 years, and they showed the students at Spelman College, these young women, and the look on their faces when the victory was announced, it was just overwhelming. So I start that way, very positively, very enthusiastically. And then comes the presidency. Doesn't measure up. I have to say that. Doesn't measure up. How come? or let's put it another way. What is the evidence that it doesn't measure up? Maybe I'm telling you things you know, and then it's a question of going on to explain, well, why, how come? And, but Obama has continued a military foreign policy. And he's continued the war in Iraq, even though, yes, he has said we're going to get out of Iraq, but there's no real sign of getting out of Iraq. And he has said, well, I'll listen to the commanders in the field about when. Dangerous thing, listen to commanders in the field. Dangerous thing to listen to commanders anywhere. But Afghanistan, he promised to send more troops to Afghanistan, and he did. And he is. Not a good sign. Furthermore, as soon as he becomes president, he sends missiles over Pakistan. You might say, oh, he doesn't personally. He's commander-in-chief. He's president. The missiles go over Pakistan, unmanned missiles, predator missiles. The word predator fits the situation. They're predators. They kill people. They kill innocent people. Say, oh, we're targeting terrorists. Whenever you hear that expression, we're targeting terrorists, beware. They can't target terrorists. You cannot bomb any place in the world and just target terrorists. If you walked right up to a person you knew was a terrorist and you shot him, you would be targeting a terrorist. But when you drop bombs from any altitude, no, you are going to kill innocent people. Innocent people have been dying in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in the presidency of a man that we expected change from. So I could say that's a disappointment, except that I wasn't really surprised. I don't want to be a know-it-all, although I am. I know it all. No, I don't want to be a know-it-all, but I didn't really, although as I say, I was enthusiastic about Obama's victory, I didn't expect the kind of bold changes that he promised or that people expected that he would put into action. I didn't really expect that, and the reason is, I attribute all my reasons to a vast and superior historical knowledge. No, but the truth is, it doesn't take a lot of history to understand that historically, Democratic presidents, by Democratic large D, presidents who become president under the aegis of the Democratic Party, have been as aggressive and violent and militaristic as Republican presidents. That's what they call bipartisanship. Really, and the word bipartisan is supposed to have a nice tone. Oh, bipartisan, we're all in this together. Yeah, they're all in this together for war. That's bipartisanship. So There are two steadfast principles that the Democratic Party historically has followed. One is expansion and war. I mean, all you have to do is look at our history. Doesn't matter whether you have Democratic or Republican presidents, expansion, war. And the other principle is the principle of maintaining the capitalist system. I know you're not supposed to use words like capitalism and socialism. It's sort of a nasty thing to do. Let's call it the market system. It sounds better. The maintenance of the market system, the so-called free market, free enterprise, that's been common to all presidents. Occasionally a president may depart from it, not totally, not fundamentally, but may make some inroads into it by making the government responsible for certain important things. That happened in the 1930s in the New Deal, and it happened in the 1960s with some of the reforms we had, domestically. But in general, that's been the second guiding principle for presidents all through history, and Obama is part of that political tradition. So it's not really surprising. It's only surprising if you created exaggerated expectations of him. It's only surprising if you romanticized him. It's only surprising if you idealized him. And if you fantasized that he would pursue what you, as a person who voted for him, would consider the right thing to do. So what does this mean? So Obama pursues militaristic policies. Now people have said, well, look at what he inherited from Bush. And I've heard that as a kind of reason for whatever faults there may be in this policy. That is not a persuasive reason. It would be persuasive if, facing this enormous burden that Bush left, that he actually began to diminish this burden even a little. He has not. On the matter of foreign policy, he has not. Unless you count words as actions. Unless, like the Nobel Prize Committee, you count speeches as actions. I don't. We've had too many examples in history of eloquent speeches made and policies which went in directly opposite that. So I think we have to come down from the high that we had at the time of the election and look realistically. Obama is a Democratic Party politician. I know when you say that, that sounds like a very demeaning term. It is. A Democratic Party politician is a Democratic Party politician. That became clear to me before Obama was elected, when Lieberman was running in Connecticut. This was early on. Lieberman, remember Lieberman, the senator, running for office in Connecticut, running for his Senate seat. And his opponent is an anti-war person named Ned Lamont. Very clear conflict. Here is Lieberman, the war lover, and here is Lamont, anti-war, and Obama goes down to Connecticut to campaign for Lieberman. That, to me, was an early sign that he was playing the game of the Democratic politician. And then the evidence has mounted up that that's what decides him. Now, sure, there's an enormous weight left over by the Bush administration, but unfortunately, he has not started to lift that weight. In too many ways, he's reinforced it. Reinforced it with war, reinforced it with even extending war, as I say, into Pakistan, and only acceding to half measures in domestic reform, half measures in health, half measures in education, half measures, compromise after compromise. I haven't looked at my watch to see if I've taken up my 10 minutes, but I will. Is there somebody who's keeping track of this? No. Good. No, I think I should finish because I suspect I'm close to 10 minutes. And I can't look at my watch and tell because I didn't look at my watch at the beginning, you see, so. But it's always a good thing to do to take out your watch and put it down on a table so people think you care, you see. So where does that leave us? It leaves us as being realistic about the fact that we cannot, and American people have never been able to, in the past, historically, look to any president to save them. But it's interesting that we're supposed to be in a democracy, and yet here we are in a democracy and you look for saviors. No, presidents are not going to save us. Congressmen, Supreme Court, they're not going to save us. Historically, Americans have been saved from the worst injustices only when they have organized and they have created movements, and those movements have created, I have to say, a turmoil in the country, as in the 30s and the 60s, and only then have presidents been moved to act. Only then have Congress has been moved to act, and that's what we are going to need in this coming period if we are going to get out of the morass that we have been left in and that we are not yet beginning to extricate ourselves from. Thank you.
I've never had to follow Howard Zinn. It's a truly intimidating, but also deeply moving privilege. When I was a young, frightened, let's say it like it was, Catholic priest, chaplain here at Boston University, quite intimidated by the radical spirit of this place when I arrived here in the late 1960s, trying to understand what the anti-war movement was, how we could be in rebellion and not be in chaos, how we could defy tradition, authority, the law. Some of you may have been here. It was a deeply troubling experience, and I was one of those who sat in the back corners of this room, known then as Hayden Hall, to sit in without permission on Howard Zinn's lectures in history. And in those lectures, I heard a language, a rationale, an ethical argument that defined the feelings I was having and enabled me eventually, still timidly always, to claim them as my own. And if you had told me in those months and couple of years that eventually, someday, through the odd course of the life story, I would wind up a friend of Howard Zinn's, able in public to declare my deep love for him, I would not have been able to imagine how such a thing could come to pass. And yet it has. So imagine how pleased I am to be here to add my voice to Howard's with my dear friends Ellen and Mary. President Obama's administration began in January of 1943. That was the month, in fact, the same week, 66 years to the week before Obama took his oath. 4 other things happened that have defined his first year. And they are, briefly, at Casablanca, Roosevelt and Churchill declared that from then on, the Allied war aim would be unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, which would lead to the unconditional destruction of Japan. That same week, the American and British Air Forces, the RAF and the AAF, agreed that they would launch together for the first time Operation Point Blank, a joint American-British bombing of the city centers of Germany. American flyers, for the first time, began to deliberately target cities. The third thing that happened that week was the opening of a laboratory in the desert in Los Alamos, the project that had been begun the previous September. Unconditional surrender joined to unconditional destruction from the air. And did I say the third thing, the fourth thing? That was the third thing. So unconditional surrender, Operation Point Blank, Los Alamos, and the fourth thing that happened that week, January 15th, 1943, was the dedication of the Pentagon, which not only symbolized but effected the replacing of individual moral agency for military power in this country with a bureaucracy for which no single person would be ethically responsible from then on. And those four things in combination launched a current, what Henry James called ahead of the First World War, a Niagara current that has been running below the surface of this nation ever since. And that current drove right through all of the opportunities to stop it. 1945, when the war ended, and we used the atomic bomb even when we didn't have to. Why? Because the current was already running. 1949, when the Soviets exploded their bomb, and suddenly the horror of this arms race became palpable when we could have stopped it, it kept going. 1953, when Joe Stalin died, the justification for our absolute terror in the Cold War, when he died, we blew right through that opportunity to change the dynamic of the Cold War. 1960, by 1961, when Kennedy became president, we are in possession of 20,000 nuclear weapons. An accumulation that was insane, and nobody, not even Curtis LeMay, thought it made sense. It was an accumulation that was the result of no choice but of this current. And that current has been running ever since, through 1968, when this country said no to the war in Vietnam, blew through it, so the war went on for another 8 years. 1976, when we elect a president who declares that he's going to bring down the arms race and stop it, blows right through the Carter years. The arms race keeps going. More nukes after Carter than before. Through even 1989, the end of the Cold War, the miracle of our lifetimes, when the world was given a precious opportunity to reinvent the structures of international order, countries around the world, including Russia, ready for something new. The United States of America blows right through it. What do we do a month after the Berlin Wall comes down? Operation Just Cause. Panama. What was the reason for the invasion of Panama? Nothing but to keep this current going. 2001, the current takes us over the Niagara Falls of the global war on terror. President Obama is at the mercy of this current. Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, an out-of-control nuclear budget that is far in excess even of the highest points of the Cold War, when our enemy was real and capable of matching us, and yet we have budgets in excess of that today. An economy more dependent on military spending than ever. So the first thing to say about President Obama's administration is it began in January of 1943. And what has he done? Words. Cairo, Prague, a declaration that his purpose includes the abolition of the nuclear weapon. The first president since the last abolitionist, Ronald Reagan, to embrace abolition as a serious foreign policy and military goal. eliminating the missile defense program in his speech in Prague, accepting responsibility for America's role in causing the world's problems, in Cairo acknowledging that our problems with Iran began with the CIA overthrow in 1953 of a democratically elected Iranian government. The President of the United States acknowledged that. Howard and I actually may disagree here. It really totally freaks me out to imagine myself disagreeing with Howard Zinn. But one of the things Howard did, despite himself, was empower me to do so. I think the words matter. And I think the Nobel Prize went to the right person. I think of it, as a friend of mine said, as an invitation to greatness. And we'll see. But that's not the point. The point is, it isn't about Obama, it's about us. What is happening at the grassroots to force Obama to be the president worthy of the Nobel Peace Prize? Don't forget how the Cold War stopped. It stopped because of a grassroots movement sparked in large part by this man, who was an inspiration to Randy Forsberg, who with her Freeze movement beginning in 1980 generated on this side of the Iron Curtain a grassroots movement that forced Ronald Reagan to change and be ready for something new when it came to him unexpectedly from Mikhail Gorbachev. And why did Mikhail Gorbachev respond that way to that moment? Because of a grassroots movement on his side of the Iron Curtain, beginning with Solidarity and Lech Walesa and all of the others of the Velvet Revolutions and the democracy movements on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Nothing happens without the grassroots, which is the point, of course, that Howard Zinn made. Howard Zinn is the voice, and has been for 50 years, of grassroots, democratic, peaceful change, which is why we are all so honored to be here tonight in his presence.
Thank you. Jim, I guess this is a shocking position for me. I guess I'm going to be the resident optimist. I did, however, take off the watch. So you are my mentor. I think I started today by looking at the polls. CNN polls, show that Obama for the first time has fewer than half the Americans agree with the president on issues. And that occurred to me how quickly people become disenchanted with anything, and how impatient, how terribly, terribly impatient we all are, all of us, and how easily it is to become critical of someone in their first 8 months in office, that they haven't changed the world. But what I thought I wanted to talk about under the topic that we were given was the idea of civility. What's happened to the idea of civility, which was so exciting a possibility when Obama presented it to us? The essential change that he promised all of us was encapsulated in the idea that he said that we are neither red states nor blue states, but United States. And this resonated deeply with the American people. And it was, in fact, his strongest selling point. It's, in many ways, this was why he beat Hillary, when she represented polarization to many people, and he was presenting this unity. It's why he beat McCain in many ways, and certainly Sarah Palin, who were both seen as divisive. This self-description, this character, this image that he has of himself as a media runs very deep into his own character. But talking about a United States and governing one are two very, very different things. So what's disappointed me is that while Americans want to be united in concept, they in fact disagree. They disagree in concrete facts, and they disagree in their worldview. And while we are attracted to civility, we are driven to opposing poles by anger. We want a man who promises mediation. We also want a man who's going to come out swinging. We want someone who wins the Nobel Peace Prize. We also want a commander-in-chief. We want someone who can lead a bipartisan coalition, and we want someone who is going to bludgeon the opposition into submission. So we've seen, I think, all of that in the past 8 months, probably especially in the healthcare debate. To me, the real Obama moment wasn't when he spoke before the Congress, and it wasn't when he spoke before Wall Street. It was when he was in Virginia, and a ninth grader looked up and said, you know, Mr. President, tell me, if you could have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be? And his answer was Gandhi. Yes, that Gandhi. And he said, in his own amusing style, it would probably be a really small meal because he didn't eat a lot. But the icon of nonviolent leadership was his inspiration. And when I first heard this, I could imagine all the way through the Beltway, all the way through Washington, this incredible groan going up. You know, Gandhi, did he actually say Gandhi, you know, in this appalling kind of voice? Because there are many, many people who had spent the entire summer waiting for Obama's inner fighter to emerge. And many on the left thought that he had gotten right-wing sand kicked into his face. So Gandhi, meet Joe Wilson. So the country, in fact, really liked and voted for this man who fashioned himself as a healer. And yet there has always been this underlying anxiety. Can you be a healer and a politician? If you try to mediate an ideological divide, will you instead actually get caught in the crossfire? It's pretty clear to me that however you look at Obama, he wants to do this leadership thing his own way. As his would-be dinner companion would say, be the change you wish to see in the world. It's also very clear that this is risky stuff. And the iconic American hero, after all, isn't Gandhi. It's Gary Cooper in High Noon. It's the man who does not seek war, but inevitably in the American narrative gets pushed into it. So this duality that we feel around political combat is really not unlike the feelings that we have raising boys in our culture, because parents want their sons to resolve arguments without being reduced to a fist fight, and they also believe that when push comes to shove, their sons had better be ready to duke it out. So the political playground, right and left, people have taken to their corners. And Obama has tried to position himself, maybe I'm doing too much shrinking here of him, but he has tried to position himself, it seems to me, as the grown-up. Some of his resistance to getting riled up that comes from, you know, recognizing that in this culture he did not want to be seen as an angry black man. It may also come from that sort of Gandhi t-shirt quote, if you keep getting an eye for an eye, pretty soon the whole world is blind. But either way, I don't think that this is a president who is going to adopt a new style as if it were a pair of designer jeans. And I'm not sure that he can pull it off. But that's the man we elected. And I think the gap between hope and reality may be a gap that very much, as Howard was saying, is a gap inside our own selves. My other disappointment to a certain extent, although I suppose that's not true because journalists are always so cynical, we're almost never disappointed. I think, let's just say the other difference between the change that we were promised and the reality is very much reflected in the fact that politics and the media are locked in this food fight. What really appalls me as a journalist as well as a citizen is how much disinformation has been absorbed now by a public that gets all of its news in this kind of closed loop. And this is very much reflected to my being somewhat less optimistic about the public arising. The public rises. It's just on opposite ends of the food fight in a struggle with themselves. I'll give you a few examples in the last year. The first is the birthers. You all know about the birthers. The people who refuse to believe that Obama was born in this country. Hawaii is a nice place to visit, but it is also a part of this country. And they are very much like the people during the election who insisted that Obama was a Muslim. They are, in fact, the most recent version of Holocaust deniers, and probably there's a lot of overlap in these groups. My father, who was a graduate of BU, used to say, often wrong, but never in doubt. And I think we could follow the birthers with the Kill Granny group. Most of you followed that, I'm sure. It was Sarah Palin and others who started the disinformation campaign warning that health care reform would include death panels, to which the elderly would come and either be allowed to live or die. And in fact, that bill contained money for doctors to be paid for the first time to actually talk to people and to ask them what kind of end-of-life care they wanted. But this is a lie that simply, not only will the lie not die, but it had a phenomenal effect on public policy because, in fact, that provision was taken out of health care reform. Now, a lot of this is clearly a deliberate campaign by right-wing commentators who don't work with the same constraints that I grew up with in the culture of the newspaper world. Being on Fox News means never saying you're sorry, but it also means never saying you're wrong. They don't run corrections on the internet, and things in this new media have a life of their own, and with the decline of newspapers and networks, there isn't any vetting. My last example of this, probably many of you have followed the story of Bill Ayers with Acorn. And after Acorn was attacked for absolutely everything, Bill Ayers said, oh, it's absolutely right. He told the conspiracy theorists that he had even actually been the author of Dreams of My Father. So this, too, had a life on the internet as a fact. In fact, I got an email just this morning that I printed out from a reader accusing the mainstream media of rejecting and not repeating the confession that Bill Ayers had made. So they don't even have a sense of humor, I'm afraid. So increasingly, Americans listen to what they already believe, and I think whatever hopes we have for civility are locked into this problem. So Joe Wilson, the congressman, raised hackles when he yelled out, "You lie," and he raised hackles for disrespecting the president. But he also raised $1.5 million for both him and for the man running against him. We both long for and we disparage fights, and we reject and reward it. There's a lot more I could list for you about the gap between change and reality in this, but I think I actually am keeping to my watch. And I don't feel at all hopeless about the president's agenda, although perhaps I wasn't as hopeful to begin with. But I do feel very reluctant, reluctant about the hope for real growing civility. I am, however, reminded of Obama's bemused response to Steve Kroft of 60 Minutes, and I'll leave you with those words. When Kroft asked him about the woes of being nonviolent in a polarized world and the problems of bringing civility to politics, he said, "It's still a work in progress." I'll vote for that.
I feel like I'm the real outlier on the panel because I'm not a journalist, I'm not an historian, I'm not a political scientist, even though Jim does fiction too. He has a much more... I don't know what to do because I'm theoretically mic'd.
Why don't you pull it up just a little?
Is this better?
Higher.
Is this better? Is that better? Yes. who was it? I'm going to take you higher. What was that? Ike and Tina Turner. I always like to identify with Tina Turner. It's always a good thing to do. As I was saying, I'm really the outlier on the panel because I'm a fiction writer. I'm a literary person. And even though Jim has written distinguished novels, he has a much better street cred than I do in terms of facts. So I want to concentrate on the aspects that I think I have some authority to speak about, and that is the words that are being used, change and reality. And let me look at the word reality from a literary point of view. Who are the realist novelists? One of the people that's supposed to be a realist novelist is Henry James. And one of the things that Henry James tells us is things are much, much more complicated than you ever think. So I want to talk about the reality of the America that elected Barack Obama. They actually elected him. That was a miracle. I do think that if the economy hadn't tanked exactly when it did, we would have President McCain. If you look at, so this leads me to the second word that I want to analyze, which is the word change. When has America changed? When has America been transformed? What have been the vessels or vehicles of transformation? One of the things that I do when I teach fiction to my students is I forbid them to use the word plot, because I say, plot will just absolutely paralyze you. We're going to talk about change. And to me, the interesting questions are, what has changed you and what are you afraid of? And I think those are the two questions that interest me in relation to Barack Obama's presidency. What has changed America? What has made us able to elect an African-American president when we wouldn't have 40 years ago? One of the things certainly was the civil rights movement, but before the civil rights movement, there was a work of the imagination that allowed the imagination of racial equality. And it seems to me that whatever Barack Obama does, he has changed the American imagination, and it's never going to go back again. I refuse to say it's only symbolism or it's only language, because one of the things that transforms us most deeply is our life of the imagination, which has its roots in language. I was thinking of Franklin Roosevelt as opposed to Harry Truman, John Kennedy as opposed to Lyndon Johnson, or even Richard Nixon. Who were the people who transformed what our idea of ourselves as Americans were? It was Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Harry Truman did a lot of fabulous things and created real change. He didn't change what we thought we were as Americans. He integrated the armed forces, but he didn't make us feel, it's different now. I can be different. Lyndon Johnson, probably at the end of the day, did a lot more for civil rights than John Kennedy did. John Kennedy changed what our idea of ourselves as Americans could be. He opened up the idea of an American in the world in the way that FDR did. What these great presidents did was to blast through one of the major diseases of Americanism, isolationism and provincialism. And one of the things that Barack Obama did was say, you know what? A lot of people are Muslim. And that's not only okay, it's good. That's huge. If he did nothing else to make the idea of an Islamic faith acceptable, not frightening, to a large segment of America is enormous. He reminds us that we are not at the center of the world anymore. When I read Dreams from My Father, I said, this guy will never get elected because he doesn't think America is the center of the universe. He doesn't think our story is the only story. He opens up our imagination. He reminds us that the world is a larger and a much more complicated place than we thought it is. That might be the most important thing that Americans need to learn. It might be the most long-lasting transformation that will be affected by Obama and that will actually carry us through to the next half century. But he's also changed real things. Let's look at the area of reproductive rights. When you think that foreign aid under the Bush administration was tied to a refusal to give out contraceptive and abortion information, that's changed. That's enormous. That's enormous for the lives of women all over the world. If he gets through, and he will get through, some sort of health care program, the lives of people who will not have their coverage denied because of a pre-existing condition, that's going to change people's lives. There's a phrase that has two different versions. One is the best is the enemy of the good, and the other is the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think we have to remember that change doesn't mean prestidigitation. He didn't say he was going to pull a rabbit out of a hat and there would be no more original sin. And I think we have to think about how we are transformed as a people and what can be achieved in a country in which a lot of people think insurance companies are fine. We have a country that thinks it's a better bet to let insurance companies run your health care than the federal government. We have a bunch of people that think that 63% of this country doesn't believe in evolution. So this is the country that Barack Obama has to govern. Dennis Kucinich would not have been elected. Everybody on this panel might be a lot happier with Dennis Kucinich's ideas. He would get 7% of the vote. So we have somebody who is not perfect, but deals in the real world, who invokes Gandhi, who insists that we give up our ethnic and religious prejudices against one of the major religions of the world, who expands reproductive rights for women all over the world, and who might actually change health care for a variety of people, and who will never, what will never go back is African American kids who will look at him and say, the world is different because this man was elected. Is it a perfect world? No. But when you look at where we were 2 years ago, look at who was in the White House, look at what we believed. We have the possibility of hope. There was no hope. There was hopelessness. And the young people that I teach were utterly hopeless. Now, I'm not saying that they all went out and became, Martin Luther King in 1 minute. They didn't. But the world has opened up. And not to be grateful for an opening up of the imagination, for an opening up of language, for an opening up of possibilities, I think is to be ungrateful for what we actually have. And this is a man who has to deal with what Jim talked about, what Ellen talked about, and he has to deal in reality. He's not Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He can't do magic realism. He has to write a realistic novel. He has to govern the country that he has. It isn't perfect, but my God, it's a lot better than what it was. And we have some hope for an opening up in a country that seems to be addicted to closing in on itself. A country that likes to get smaller and smaller, more and more frightened, more and more inward looking, more and more defensive, is led now by a person who insists that the world is larger and more complicated than perhaps they are even comfortable with. So I hate to say it, I might be the resident optimist. That's really new for me. Thank you.
Well, that's food for thought. I couldn't help thinking when you were talking about fiction and complication and reality and all of that, that one of the first real popular images of an African-American president going about his daily business was in the television show 24, which left a lot of my liberal friends every week rooting for torture for a higher good. So complication, fiction. Let's take some time now. There are 2 microphones. I'm going to invite people to come stand before them and ask brief questions, some response. Hope we can get some good audience participation for the next 20 minutes or so before we go to a conclusion. Please.
Hi. It's wonderful to see Howard and Jim here. Together with them, we were all fighting the good fight in the days of the Vietnam War when we didn't have such a sympathetic administration at Boston University. Hope. Yes, hope is a wonderful thing. I remember reading Basil Davidson's book on the liberation of Guinea, one of the first states in Africa where the people gained power through a revolutionary movement. The problem the leadership faced, he says, was not to convince people that they were oppressed and that they had horrible living conditions. The problem was to give them hope that by taking action they could change things, because people don't give up what they have for a hopeless struggle. So hope is a tremendous force. But I remind you of what Langston Hughes says. What happens to the vision of a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And you may think of Lorraine Hansberry's play. A vision of a dream deferred, in other words, when that hope is not realized, is a very dangerous thing and can lead very quickly to reaction. I remind you, for example, what happened in France in 1968, where there was a tremendous hope for radical change, and for a number of reasons I won't go into, that hope was very quickly disappointed. De Gaulle left Paris and then returned in triumph when that hope was disappointed, and a period of reaction set in, which took about 20 years to overcome. Now, I'm afraid in this country that is a real possibility. We don't just have people with hope for progressive change, we have people with hope for reactionary change. I won't say fascism, but certainly very many reactionary forms of racism, sexism, economic reaction, and so forth. And we can't just discount this, particularly in the situation we're living in today, when we have these foreign policy impasses that Howard and Jim spoke about, and America is going to suffer real defeats on the international scale unless it makes some real adjustments. And it's going to have to adjust to a lowered role in the world than our leadership has given us the illusion that we have. And on the economic front, one more minute. On the economic front, you know, we have a crisis, an economic crisis, and on whose backs is it being solved? The advantages are being given to the ruling class, the capitalist class, the big industrialists and the big financiers. And who is suffering? The poor people. And as long as this goes on, there's going to be a great disappointment of hope. And I think there's a real danger of reaction in this country. So we must not only worry about hope, we have to worry about the disappointment of hope. And unless we get a mass movement of rallied to force on the administration positive changes, we may find ourselves facing very negative changes. Things can change very rapidly.
Thank you. Perhaps we can hear a question?
Sure. Mine's a question, yes. This is directed specifically to Mr. Zinn, but anyone, I would definitely like to hear your thoughts on this. This isn't really necessarily about what we were talking about tonight, but kind of more a general thing. I was wondering if you believed in such a thing as human nature, as in like an innate like way that all human beings react, like kind of specifically as in reference to what the founders believed in as human nature, kind of like what is found in the state of nature, and the implications of that, and or whether or not you are more like along the lines of like a Marxist critique of when given the correct social and material and economic conditions, human beings can act in a more positive and collaborative kind of way, or if there will always be conflict because of this innate human nature that is going to be there forever?
Well,
Please.
I didn't expect such a profound question, but you're asking about human nature. Right. Yeah. And what role do I think human nature plays?
Well, whether or not there is one, and if like kind of specifically as the founders like conceived of human nature, and like whether or not it's just like as like the Marxist critique goes, it's just only because of the way of the social and material
Yeah.
conditions people act the
Yeah.
way they do, like screwing
I-
over
I-
each
I
other, killing
understand.
each other, and whatnot.
Yeah. I think it was John Stuart Mill. Always a good thing to quote, right? John Stuart Mill said, there's nothing so facile and wrong as attributing some important piece of human behavior to human nature. Actually, he said it much more eloquently, because they used to talk more eloquently in those days.
That's why no one understands it anymore.
Difference between the way politicians spoke in the 18th century and the way politicians speak today? Yeah, no, they spoke
They weren't
more,
talking to the ignorant masses
they
then,
spoke
that's
more
why.
eloquently in those days. But generally, I've heard two things attributed to human nature which always troubled me. One, people would attribute war to human nature, and the other, people would attribute greed to human nature. Well, it's very convenient to attribute war to human nature, because if it's human nature, well, it takes the onus off the people who make war. And if I don't know if this fits what you were thinking about.
No, good.
Yeah, but of course we up here don't care if it fits what the questioner asked. We just want to say what we want to say. Yeah, see, and if war was in human nature, governments wouldn't have to work so hard to get us to go to war. In order to people don't rush to war. Governments induce them, propagandize them, coerce them, cajole them, bribe them. They have to work very, very hard to mobilize people for war. If there is any thing in human nature, and people don't know much about human nature, and the evidence about of what there is in human nature is very, very fuzzy. But I believe if there is any characteristic of human nature which relates to this, I believe that people generally want to be at peace with one another. I believe this is natural. Don't ask me for genetic evidence, but I do believe that. Although to me the historical evidence is there, people have to be driven and propagandized to war. War does not come out of human nature. The other thing they say is, well, if you say something about capitalism, if you don't like capitalism, I don't like capitalism. And if you say something negative about capitalism is in human nature. That's what people want to accumulate more. And, that's the way it is. People want to compete. I don't believe that's true at all. You were talking about other economic and social conditions.
Yeah, like the Marxist critique
cause
of
people to behave in certain ways. Sure, if you grow up in a society which rewards greed, then you will become greedy. If you grow up in a society where everything in the culture moves you towards competition with your fellow man or woman, yes, but no. I don't believe that we are naturally voracious and greedy. I believe that it's possible. And you see this in history, you see this in you see there are communities where people have lived without that, and families live that way, and very often little groups of people live that way, and very often people who are working together in social movements live in a cooperative and unselfish way. So I guess I could have answered your question very, very briefly by saying,
No.
I don't believe in human nature.
Thank you.
Hi. This is directed mostly toward Mr. Carroll, but I'd love if any of the panelists contributed. You were talking about this current that's been flowing under the American government and society for decades, and you said that Obama's fighting against this current. Do you think that he can fight against it? And if so, how would he do that? If not, can we? And if so, how would we fight against this current that's been flowing under us for, 60 years?
Well, thank you for asking me to elaborate the point. I'll just say briefly that President Obama has declared himself against it, and I take that seriously. It's certainly the powerful meaning of the important detail that Ellen drew our attention to about Gandhi. When President Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, he was against it too, remember, having just presided over its establishment, coming to maturity. He could have called it the military-industrial, academic, barbershop, entertainment, streetcar, automobile, highway building, manufacturing, sleep in your nightshirt, sleep in your skivvies, you name it. Any aspect of American life has been brought into this. That's how powerful it is. So it's hugely important that we have a President of the United States who understands it. President Obama does. He has spoken about it. And who has declared himself against it. Will it swamp him? I hope not. Maybe. Could he stand against it powerfully? Mikhail Gorbachev stood powerfully against his version of the same current and changed history and saved the world from a catastrophe. So in our own lifetimes, we've got an example of somebody who did. So I am hopeful, actually.
Hi, this question is for Mr. Zinn and as well as the entire panel. I was wondering, what advice can you give to a member of a generation who expects things to happen instantaneously and without having any involvement? Because I feel like there are a lot of people my age who want change, but there are largely, I feel like my generation expects things to happen witut doing anything. So I'm just wondering what...
Doing anything that you can't do on Facebook.
Right, perhaps, yeah.
So it's to you.
Yeah, so any words of wisdom on that?
This is a
Anybody over
question
there?
you addressed to me and to the panel.
Yes.
Anyone?
If anyone has
Well,
any
let's
thoughts.
hear from the other members of the panel. Jim and I have had a little say.
I'd like to say why. I think if you believed that something could happen, you would do it. And it's not that you're lazy and bad and stupid and just spend all your time on Facebook. You're not. As a generation, I think you're quite wonderful. I think one of the things that your generation says to mine is you were all deluded. You thought you changed the world. You thought you were against war, and then you all voted for Reagan and Bush. And so I think in a way we have betrayed you. We have not modeled well for you what meaningful action would be in a critical enough mass. So I think that I don't want to just say it's all your fault. I think that in a way you need models, and you have not been provided with models. You've been provided with a lot of people who don't walk it like they talk it. And that's why I think on one level your paralysis has a kind of noble side to it, that you don't want to be bullshitters like you think some of us were. And I don't think that's the end of the story, but I think that it's not because you're lazy and sated by technology. I think you're waiting to see an action that will be meaningful rather than delusional, and it hasn't been provided for you yet.
Thank you very
I
much.
think I think there are a couple of things that are going on. I mean, your generation is much more likely to do one-on-one, hands-on, direct delivery of that connection. And our generation was much more likely to do a kind of mass movement. I think a couple of other things. For one thing, what we didn't tell our children necessarily was how much fun we had. I've seen this, I think, particularly in the women's movement, which often we're looking for someone to pass the torch to, and nobody's picking up the torch, and we're moaning and groaning about how nobody will pick up the torch, and they're moaning and groaning about, my God, you guys all worked your tails off, and you were doing everything, and that was just too much. We don't want to live the way you do. And one of the things that we didn't tell them was, well, right, but we had a wonderful time doing collective action, so that there's been a much more individualistic streak among our children's generation. And I think the return to recognizing how much you can't do individually and how much you can do collectively would be quite refreshing for our children's generation, not just because we want to be the, half-baked models that we were.
I direct this question, Howard. I direct this question to Howard. Not to the exclusion of the other members of the panel, but you made a remark at the end of your original remarks about the need for movements down below that might create turmoil, in any case, that would put pressure on the administration to bring about effective change. I wonder if you could simply point out any developments of that sort that are currently going on now.
Well, obviously we're not seeing a national movement of the kind we saw, let's say, in the movement against the war in Vietnam, and we're not seeing a national movement such as we saw in the civil rights movement. But I think very often we are looking at the timetable at the wrong point. That is, and it has to do also, this relates to the whole question of patience and hope, right? Because when you ask what is going on now, there are people all over this country who are active and organized in small ways against war, for sexual gender equality, to change the environment. I mean, if you go into any town in this country, and I travel, and I think the other people on this panel travel, and I suspect they've had the same experience I have. Whatever town you go into, whether it's a large city or small place, there are always little groups of people who are working on something good and something useful. And so we have the germ, we have the potential, we have, I think, the beginnings of what could be a much larger and more powerful national movement. You have to look at the movements, the successful movements that we've had in the past, not at the point when they were at their crest, but you have to look at them at the point when they were starting out. And when these movements were starting out, people ask the same question you just asked. What's going on? Do we see any sign of any real force in the country that will change things? And if I lived in the South for 7 years. I moved with my family to Atlanta, Georgia, in 1956, and in the late 1950s, people looking at the South said, "Well, black people have been oppressed here for such a long time. Segregation has existed for almost 100 years. Where is the movement?" Well, small things were happening here and there under the surface, and that's how change takes place. Small things happen. Individuals, little groups, and they're patient. Not patient in the sense of being passively patient, being actively patient. That is, being active and being patient in the sense of not expecting immediate and dramatic results, understanding historically that very tiny movements taking place on a small scale throughout the country at a certain point grow into something dramatic, powerful. You have to have the kind of patience that is willing to continue working, not to give up, and not to think that because you've participated in 3 demonstrations and the war hasn't stopped, that well, I guess we can't do it this way. And so I think it's very important, I think, for young people to realize that if they will just do small things, you don't have to be a hero. There are heroes, and there are people who do heroic things, but you don't have to. If you continue doing small things, working with other people, even in the smallest of ways, and you, at some point in history, it's not inevitable, but there's a good chance that at some point in history, those thousands, millions of small acts will merge into some great movement. And the saving grace for asking patience, even though you're not seeing immediate results, is what Ellen was talking about. And this is what I very often tell people, that you don't have to wait and hope for some great cataclysmic moment of change that will take place in the next year or in the next 5 years, or maybe not in your lifetime. Because while you're working for these things, there's something wonderful about working with other people, something very pleasurable, something fun in working with other people towards a common goal. There's something that all of you believe in.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for everything, guys. Howard Zinn. My question is kind of in relation to that question. We do have all these small little grassroots projects going on, maybe under the scenes. But when is it these days that people are actually going to get riled up by these kind of things and actually make a massive movement and show Washington that there is actually a following and a need for some change?
You want a date?
Well, what's it going to take for everyone to rally together, and how angry do we have to get?
Yeah, no, I think it's impossible to say at what point, something will change in a very dramatic way. You just keep working, and you don't know.
But it's also, it's also that moment of rising expectations that people did come out for Obama. This is only a year since people were totally riled up and coming out for change. And by the way, opposition comes out for change. You have tea parties, you have the high-profile of endless listservs of angry conservatives. You have people coming out. So it isn't just the good people waiting for the moment where they will organize. One of the most powerful movements in the country has been the Right to Life movement, which I couldn't disagree with more. But as an organizing tool, it's been enormously powerful. And sometimes people also get overwhelmed by the profile of their opposition. I mean, if you read my email, you would think that the whole world was a listserv of Fox viewers. So, I mean, one of the things, it seems to me too, is important to resist and help people to resist the notion that the people who oppose them are more powerful than they are, by creating your own opposition to the opposition, in a sense, and also to remember that there are groups on both sides who are organizing, and not to get depressed and exaggerate the numbers of the enemy, and to get feeling, oh God, we're just losing again. Because that's been a kind of repetitive, self-destructive pattern among many in the left, too.
I also think that if you say there's, what Ellen talked about with the fragmentation and the number of causes, so if you said that in the 30s, the reason why political activism happened was because of the Great Depression. It was one thing, it was very easy to focus on. Civil rights movement was galvanized by school integration and voting rights. They were very clear. Vietnam protests happened because there was a draft, not because we were such peace-loving, wonderful people, but because white middle-class kids didn't want to go to war, and that's why. If there were a draft now, you'd see a movement in a nice big hurry. And so I think, again, it's the failure of the imagination to focus upon something that will galvanize action. And also I think one of the things that's different is, why does everybody think money is so good and important? Why does everybody think they need so much money to live well? Nobody's questioning that. It seems to me in the 30s, the bad guys in movies were rich. I haven't seen a movie in which a bad guy was rich in a really long time. I think, again, our whole relationship to money, how much we think we need for a good life, makes us unwilling to take risks in protest and lifestyle that will endanger our safe little lives, because we can't focus on a good that would seem as desirable as another iPod. And so I think what we lack is clarity.
These good people have somewhere to go shortly, so I think rather than having closing statements, let's stick with the people's questions for just a couple of minutes, try to take a couple more. Thanks.
Thank you. My question is primarily for Howard and Jim. I'd love to hear all of your responses, but the two, Howard and Jim, seem the most dissatisfied, shall we say. And I'd like to know what you would have President Obama do. I know that you're dissatisfied, but in theory, we all love democracy, and we're not working with a very cooperative Congress, and you could have all of these sweeping reforms by setting an enormous precedent for further executive power. And we all hated the signing statements under Bush, but is it suddenly okay when Obama does it? I just want to know, what would you have him do to be satisfied?
You mean for me to be satisfied? I'm not easily satisfied. But right, assuming now that I'm setting out goals for Obama, understanding the problems, understanding the difficulties, understanding the Niagara of the military-industrial complex, and et cetera, et cetera. But what would I like to see him do? Well, I'd like to see him get up before the microphone, speaking to a national audience, and say, it seems clear. One, we cannot win a war in Afghanistan. Two, we shouldn't want to win a war in Afghanistan. It's not our country. It belongs to the people of Afghanistan. We are killing people unnecessarily in this fantasy that we are going to transform Afghanistan into a liberal and democratic society. The English tried it. They didn't have such an aim. The Russians actually didn't have such an aim. We claim such an aim, but we are accomplishing exactly what the other imperial powers accomplished. We are going to get out of Afghanistan as fast as we can, and we are going to, we're going to do something that may shock people, but I said we're willing to talk to anybody. We're even willing to talk with the Taliban. We're even willing, there are different elements in the Taliban. We can negotiate. We can try to negotiate. We can assemble some international group of people who will no longer have the onus of the United States and its military occupation, but who will maybe be in a position, to negotiate and work with the Afghan people. But we are going to stop thinking that our military presence is helping anything in Afghanistan. It is not. We are going to do the same thing with Iraq. We are going to withdraw from Iraq as soon as as soon as ships and planes can carry our troops out. We are not doing any good there. And people always raise dire scenarios about what will happen when we leave. They did the same thing in Vietnam. Oh, we can't leave Vietnam. It will be terrible. So we stayed, and it was terrible. And then when we left, it wasn't as terrible as we thought. It wasn't great, but it wasn't as terrible as our military actions were doing in Vietnam. No, I would withdraw. I would declare that we are not going to be an aggressive war-making power anymore. We are going to dismantle the military bases we have in 100 countries. Those bases are not protecting us. All that they are doing is inflaming people's anger in all those places where we have bases and giving enormous profits to the corporations that make money from the maintenance of these bases. I am going to take the money that we are going to save by cutting our military budget very, very drastically. I'm going to take that, and then we are going to have several $1 trillion available, several $1 trillion available to give everybody free health care, not through insurance companies, not to the kind of health program that they have in many other countries which have better health systems than we do, and where everybody has free health care. You don't have to fill out forms, and you don't have to do this, you don't have to do that. In other words, we're going to give everybody the kind of health care that people in the military have, that people in the Congress have. And let me say something as president to you, because this has not been said by any president for quite a while, and that is that don't be afraid of what they call big government. Big government is what we have always had in this country from the beginning. From the time the Constitution was created, we have had big government, strong central government. That's what the Constitution set up. But that government has generally acted on behalf of the wealthy classes. And when it has acted on behalf of the wealthy classes, it was not called big government. When the government began to do things for poor people, then the cry went up, big government. Big government is Social Security, which is a very efficient, helpful thing. Big government was the GI Bill of Rights, which gave college education to millions of people. Yes, and we can have big government in health, and don't worry about it. If you don't have big government, you will have big corporations. And you have much less power over corporations than over government, where at least you can vote for government. You don't vote for corporations. So, well, that's just the start.
I think we need to move to our last question, please.
Okay. The last time I think I asked Howard Zinn a question, this was called Hayden Hall, and it was, you know, he was teaching a course called Civil Liberties. But I want to go quickly from there. I was one of the leaders of the 1970s, 60s. We shut down BU in 1970. We didn't even have a commencement. And I was one of the leaders of the student government who did that. So to start, I want to just take quick opposition with Mary Gordon's assertion that the draft was what motivated us. BS. Our conscience motivated us. The draft was something that we opposed, and those of us who turned in our draft cards or what have you faced incredible penalties. It wasn't fear, it was conscience, Mary. Secondly, why can't people in the media, including Jim and Ellen, actually talk directly? Militarism, imperialism. 164 different countries, we got military bases, and I think Howard's addressed this before, but why isn't it addressed in the so-called left-wing liberal media that you guys write in and week out? John Marcy.
Hey, John.
Wait a minute, the left-wing media is the Boston Globe.
Oh, come on. Mother Jones, The Nation, Grandma, come on. That's not my question. Why can't you just, instead of, Jim called it some sort of a cultural undertide, or I forget exactly his words, but why can't you just directly say,
You can directly say. You may not directly say it.
I've read the Globe for forever.
You can if you want to. You're assuming that I want. You're my mouthpiece. I want to say I have a sense of what language and how to construct things and what it is that I want to say. If you want to speak that way, you should write that way. That's fine, and you will find some publication. And Jim certainly does write. Jim certainly does write as strongly about these issues as anybody in my.
Well, I'm just wondering why the Globe basically sort of refuses to allow this to surface, so to speak.
Well, I think we have a different point of view on whether that is
But
reality.
let me just say this, that Jim Carroll has had some very powerful and eloquent columns on militarism and war. If you follow, the problem is that he is very close to being alone on the op-ed pages of the Globe and in journalism in general. And the problem is that the media in general, of course, is a media that goes along with establishment policy. So if we had a lot more voices like Jim and like Ellen's and a lot more voices, well, then it would be a different kind of media.
I'd like to just observe something in response to you. John, did you say?
Yes.
Strike Dorm. Do you remember Strike Dorm?
Yeah, I remember
We took over, it was called 500 or 700.
Yeah.
Then now it's called Warren Towers. But the students took over the dormitory, and it goes to a question or an observation that someone else at the microphone made a while ago, which is when does something happen? What happened that spring is the United States military shot and killed college students, white students in Ohio and black students in Mississippi, or I think Mississippi. The United States government shot and killed American college students, and college students all over this country shut down the universities. Commencements were canceled all over America. It was a terrible thing. Look, if President Obama takes us deeper into war in Afghanistan, there are going to be moments when we as people are going to have to find ways to respond. Here's hoping he gives the speech that Howard just invited him to give. Here's hoping. If he does the other thing, if he goes with the pressure that's on him, partly because there's not enough counter pressure from the rest of us, then there will be plenty of moments, I'm afraid, where people are going to be conscripted to express themselves in terrible ways in this country, because that's what the war in Afghanistan will surely lead to. A war in Pakistan, a war with a nuclear power. I mean, the consequences of mistakes, mistaken decisions in Washington over the next few weeks and months are going to be world historic. And we will get plenty of chances, all of us,
let me just
to express ourselves.
Let me just correct the historical record. The student strike started in New Haven, Connecticut, after the incidents. Or before, I'm not quite sure. We came back from a rally in New Haven in response to the Bobby Seale, the Black Panther thing. And Boston University was the first school to go on strike. And it had nothing to do with fear of the draft. It had everything to do with opposition to the war and conscience. That's all I'm saying. You were the chaplain here.
No, that's clear. You and I do not disagree.
I was one of the people you were trying to understand.
You and I do not disagree.
So I lied to you.
Damn.
That wasn't the last voice. Let's give the last voice to someone younger.
Thank you. This is pretty much directed towards everybody. I listen to a lot of punk rock, and there's one musician, a really big political activist, Joel Biafra, who's mentioned a lot in his spoken word that the government and the media kind of conspire together to cut off access to certain pieces of information in the news and sometimes dumb down the news so you never really get to know what's necessary. Like Britney Spears just got liposuction instead of wondering where the tax dollars are going, stuff like that. Would you agree with that, or is that a bit of an exaggeration?
It goes to the point you were making.
Well, it's a lot worse now than it was, and it's partially viewer driven or clicker driven, or people rant against the People magazine view of the world, and they don't want to be interested in it, and yet they read it. And so it's driven by the same people who may on a given day rant against it. A lot of us who have watched what's happened to the mainstream media, this sense that there is nobody out there vetting the news, that there is nobody who can screen out the false stuff that's coming in, that's extremely depressing to those of us who are in the media, and yet it's now a free-for-all. And you're saying somehow that, can you read it? I'm sorry, can you describe it again, and I can...
Well, the theory that Biafra posed was...
Yeah, that somehow...
That they're somehow conspiring to just cut off certain bits of information, like give us news that we don't really need.
At this moment, everything is out there. The good, the bad, and the ugly, and the immediate. There's nobody correcting it. That's one of the things I was trying to say. There's nobody correcting it. It's all a kind of a crowdsourced world, and the crowd is either right or wrong. There are no editors in the internet world. I'm exaggerating, but not by a whole lot. So I don't think it's become harder and harder to blame the media, and especially the mainstream media, which is on this downhill trajectory of its own. It's just all out there immediately. And one of the things that's happened in the news world that is the least heralded is, for example, in covering wars, covering any foreign news, we have fewer and fewer boots on the ground. so that the blogosphere is like an inverted pyramid. You have fewer and fewer people actually doing the reporting, more and more people commenting about it. And commentary has become this ungrounded world where all you have to do is say what you think. And I've always thought that saying what you think implied that you had to think. And
Nice.
And that's really not so true anymore. People just say it, and they throw their opinion out, and there's no price to be paid for a wrong one. That's what I was trying to say in that amazing story about the joke that Ayers tried to say when he said, you know, I actually wrote dreams from my father. And then that gets out there as if it were actually true. My own most disheartened days are when I think that nobody cares about facts anymore. Because, you know, when we were growing up as young reporters, you'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning having that horrible moment. Oh my God, did I say it was 3,238 or did I say it was 2,340? You know, and calling into your city editor. And the importance of getting it right and the consequences for not getting it right, no matter how people think about the mainstream media. As a young reporter, those consequences were enormous. And as there are fewer and fewer people overseeing it, reporting it, vetting it, shaping it, it becomes extremely free. Everybody can say what they want, but it's like looking up cancer on the internet without going to a source that knows anything. And that's pretty much the way people are getting their information now. And it's pretty disheartening.
Thank you very much. I apologize.
Oh, it was a negative note. No.
Could I just then have one other note? I would just observe the other great fact of our culture and our world today is that among all these other things that are happening, Howard Zinn has never had more readers, has never had more influence. He has a film that's about to premiere. Howard Zinn's message and voice has never been stronger. And if that, I mean, it says great things about Howard Zinn, but it also says something really good about this country.
Nice footnote.
Thank you, Jim. I always measure progress in this country by how many people read my stuff.
I apologize to those who still have questions, but I suspect on a topic like contemporary politics, every one of us, if we're half intelligent, still has questions to ask. Please join me in thanking Mary Gordon and Ellen Goodman and Jim Carroll and, of course, Howard Zinn for a wonderful review.